Much. So I just want to thank you for having me and my brilliant colleague, Devin Michelle Bunten, here today to present a project we've been working on with the very large and wonderful group of colleagues that you see pictured here, which was to conduct a landscape scan into racially just research in urban studies and planning. And before we begin, Devin and I just want to acknowledge that the research for this project and the land we're both calling in from are traditional unceded territories of the Wampanoag Nation and Massachusetts people, as described in more detail here in this land acknowledgement statement. So first, a bit of background on our overarching project aim and our methods. So we went into this project with the aim of understanding what is meant in practice when research in urban studies and planning is described as racially just, anti-racist, emancipatory, decolonial, or a host of other terms that are typically used to describe research that advances racial justice. And this aim was motivated by the fact that while there are lots of powerful and impactful examples of urban planning scholars who center racial justice in their research, we weren't aware of a resource that discusses how the field as a whole understands the hallmarks of anti-racist, abolitionist, emancipatory, and decolonial projects, and that this really stands in contrast to other fields like education or public health or geography that have put out resources over the past 10 or 20 years discussing the hallmarks of racially just research in those subfields. So we really approached this as an empirical project to see what is, and we collected data through three different modes. The first was a community survey that we fielded across members of the Department of Urban Studies and Planning, staff, faculty, and students. And while this was part of our process and we wanted to share it, because it's so specific to our department, we aren't going to present these results today. But basically, we did conduct a community survey asking about people's level of confidence in distinguishing between research about race and research that advances racial justice, as well as a host of other questions. The second mode of data collection that we used was a series of key informant interviews. The purposes of these interviews was really to identify characteristics of and identify the supports and barriers that thought leaders in the field identified for best practices for conducting anti-racist research. We identified people who were known for their expertise on racial justice and in racial justice and research in particular. We selected people who were leaders of academic or institutional settings and leaders within their own settings in understanding and supporting anti-racist research practices. These folks came from urban studies and planning, as well as allied fields such as urban design, architecture, public health, medicine, urban sociology, and other allied fields. We so far have conducted 14 of these interviews. And because we were looking at institutional leaders, we were really missing the voices of earlier stage academics who are often at the cutting edge. And the last way in which we collected data was conducting the landscape scan itself. And so a little bit of more background on how we conducted the landscape scan. We identified institutions, agencies, organizations, and individual researchers who had long and credible histories of doing anti-racist, racially just, emancipatory research. I've listed a few of the examples of the types of institutions and organizations we identified. And since January of last year, we've been using kind of a snowball methodology to collect papers, project examples of models that have been lifted up by the organizations, institutions, and researchers in the landscape scan as models of promoting racial justice through research. So our detailed methodology was to conduct an informational field scan of literature and materials with the kind of selection criteria I just described. Our literature review, the search terms were really varied, and you can see some of the terms we use listed as point 1A. And we use this literature search, this scan, to understand the features and characteristics of anti-racist research and to identify those model projects. We then use the key informant interviews to kind of check our understanding of the key themes we thought we were seeing in the landscape scan. And we're hoping that eventually all or part of our findings will be publicly available. We're working on several academic papers and an online archive at the moment. The analysis stage of our landscape scan was basically to distill the themes that we came across through going through all of the materials that we found through our literature search and our scan of agencies and organizations. We built a master document with common words and phrases appearing in the scan. We tied together similarities through our faculty working group. We checked these final themes with key informant interviews, and then we cross-referenced themes to see how they showed up in model projects. So what we basically ended up with was a process that used about 60 key sources of information to distill 10 themes on the characteristics of racially just and decolonial research, which we're about to go through, and then a set of model projects that showed how these key themes show up in action. And I just want to note before turning over to Devin Michelle Bunten to give our results, that what we noticed going through our landscape scan was the clear influence of other fields of research and key theories that have been developed in other subfields as the foundations for the resources we were identifying. And so, the list of these foundations, I just want to be clear, this is not a list of what we were wanting to see or what we were searching for in the beginning. This is a list of what we saw in use after going through the resources that met our search criteria and speaking to the people that met our selection criteria for interviews. What were the common underlying theories across the resources that came into our scan? And what we saw is the influence of all of these subfields and theories. For example, critical race theory, recognizing that racism is normal in the United States because it's been codified into law, embedded in structures, and woven into public policy, for example. And we could go on and talk about the relevance of each of these theories, but we want to acknowledge these key foundations for our work. And with that, I will turn to Devin Michelle Bunten to start walking us through the results.
Great, thank you, Mariana. So I'm just going to dive right in. So we're going to go through the themes one by one briefly. A lot of them do have some amount of overlap, so you'll see some ideas coming back up. But the first theme that we saw prevalent in research that's anti-racist is that such research includes a theory of change. And this notion is, fairly common, I think, in planning spaces. But this theory of change is the way that a research project explicitly intends to advance racial justice, and also discloses how it sees itself as doing so, as supporting racially just outcomes. Of course, this can be done in a variety of ways that are really contextual to the research itself. But some examples include things like providing analyses directly for community-based organizations that support local action and need some technical, could be used some technical evaluation support, things like that. Slide. Oh. Thank you. The second theme is that anti-racist research acknowledges and goes into, starts from the premise that racialized difference is socially produced. And so that can take, again, a variety of forms, including all the different types of theoretical traditions that Mariana just shared. But some, at a high level, it's adopting explanatory theories and frames that understand racialized difference as the product of social forces rather than biological forces or other sort of naturalizing forces like cultures and things like that. And so this can, again, take a variety of forms, including research that asks questions like, what are the social determinants of measured racial disparities? Or how exactly does white supremacy operate? And so we're going to try to include a couple of transportation themed examples on this, although Mariana and I do want to note that we are not transportation researchers. And so these will be highly selected examples from people we know. But the first one is actually a project that I'm collaborating with some folks who do transportation research, where we try to understand what the social factors or the social determinants are through which Black Americans are obligated into longer commutes than white Americans. Next slide, please. The third theme that we see come up often in anti-racist research is that of reconciliation and reparation. And so anti-racist research tends to enact processes or develop research products that support those who've been injured by racial injustice in obtaining what they need to heal or to redress the harms that have been done, which is to say reparations. And this is often the primary vehicle or a primary vehicle by which that research advances racial justice. And so this in some ways has some overlap again with our first theme of theory of change, but was also common and sort of particular enough that it seemed worth calling out as its own. So again, this can take many forms. Sometimes that can mean documenting harms that have been done, and in other cases, maybe it means following community-led processes about or marginalized voices in defining what those harms and redress should look like as you go about the research. Slide. The fourth theme is the way that anti-racist research approaches and understands racist power structures. And so in most of the cases that we looked at in our landscape scan, anti-racist research acknowledges that there are racist structures of power in the world that are shaping the environment in the context under research. And in many cases, fewer than the most, but still in many cases, anti-racist research facilitates the sharing of power in order to shift those power structures. And so the research often includes descriptions of how racist power structures operate at the macro and meso and micro levels to maintain racialized difference in a variety of ways that are, very context dependent to the project at hand. Next slide, please. The fifth theme that often came up is around the approach to methodological tradition that anti-racist research tends to enact. And so, and I guess at a high level, we're embedded in, I'm an economist, and economists have been involved in a variety, economist research has been involved in a variety of racist harms through its history. And so the methodological tradition is an important site of sort of undertaking anti-racist research. And so in many cases, or in most cases rather, anti-racist research is transparent in disclosing those methods and research traditions that are used and drawing attention to the limitations or cautions that sort of come with those that are, either manifest in the methods or the history. And in many cases, anti-racist research also adopts methods and traditions that try to push against that center lived experience, that may use decolonial methods or data sources, or that validate different types of data and ways of knowing. And a prime example of this that emerged regularly is PAR research, participatory action research. And this is less a methodology and more of a modality that can be enacted in quantitative and qualitative and in a variety of different sort of methodological environments. Next slide, please. The sixth theme that we want to highlight is the anti-racist research approaches to context and history. And so in most cases, anti-racist research acknowledges these things, acknowledges context and history directly. Sometimes researchers may have limitations in their ability to do so. And so in most cases, if that's the case, then that's acknowledged. In many cases, anti-racist research seeks to understand context and history and embed that within the project itself through the positionality of the research team or participation of affected communities directly, as mentioned before, sometimes through a PAR process. Next slide. And the seventh theme that we identified is called identifying agency, or return identifying agency. And so anti-racist research that is centered on marginalized communities can uplift assets and agency instead of primarily or solely taking a damage-based approach, which, as described by Eve Tuck, documents harms and reduces communities, or risks reducing communities to their problems rather than seeing them in their fullness. The flip side of that is that research that's done on dominant communities directly can actually clarify the agency of such communities in the creation or continuation of racialized difference. And so, to call out one contrast, the bottom of our little table here, an assets and agency approach can foster community self-determination and leadership, whereas a deficits and damage approach risks fostering white saviorism or external interventions that may not fully respond to concerns and or may not tap into the existing assets and strengths of a community. And we have another example, again, from our biased sample of people we know who do transportation-themed research, the book People Before Highways by our colleague Carolyn Crockett. And we think this is a good example of both theme 6 and 7, that it is, Carolyn documents the history of the Boston anti-highway movement, its history, its context, both geographically, its context vis-a-vis other interventions in the built environment in Boston and the civil rights movement overall, and really centers and uplifts the agency of the communities, the activists and the urban planners involved in this project, this movement that came together and ultimately stopped several freeways from being built here in Boston. Including one that is 2 blocks from my house right now. And I'm very grateful that it's a park and not a freeway. So it's my preferred example. And I'll hand it back to Mariana now.
Thank you so much, Devin. So I'll cover the final 3 themes and just close us out. So the 8th theme of 10 that we noticed was that anti-racist research is attentive to ethical issues in human subjects research in a way that is different from typical research. So in most cases, anti-racist research will enact the Belmont principles, which are principles for protecting human subjects in research, respect for persons, doing good, or complying with one's moral obligations, justice, beneficence, right? And what we found is that at a minimum, anti-racist research will enact these principles, but will do so through an equity lens, thinking about what does respect for persons mean in this community, in this setting. But then in many cases, anti-racist research also added to or augmented additional principles when thinking about the ethics of doing human subject research. And this could take many forms. For example, thinking about community implications, community oversight, or understanding, having a greater extent of understanding of what harms might be given the particular history or context of a community. The 9th theme that we noted revolves around this idea of positionality. So in most cases, the research that we reviewed at least recognizes and acknowledges the positionality of marginalized communities to traditional research and meaning-making practices, noting where communities have really been the site of extractive research that does not benefit them. And in many cases, the projects that we reviewed centered or focused on or centrally involved as decision makers in research these communities themselves, which was a real change. Okay, and then the last theme is about inviting critique and reflection. So the models that we looked at, really sought critical feedback and reflected throughout the research process to ensure that features that made the project anti-racist are maximally integrated, right? So, and the ways in which people do this are highly variable. So it could be that through community participation and oversight, there's an avenue for critique and reflection. This also could take the form of transparent reporting so that everything the project is doing is sort of online for the world to see, or formal incorporation of reflective practices from the urban studies and planning tradition. And so with that, those are the results from our landscape scan. We want to thank you for having us, even though we are not transportation researchers. We were really excited to be here because transportation has so often been at the center for racial justice struggles, at least in the United States. from the civil rights bus boycotts to protests against urban renewal to current day fights for more public transportation funding. So we really appreciate the chance to be part of this conversation, and we are looking forward to Lake's response. Thank you.